In my last devlog, I mentioned a skill tree, and the funny thing is, I actually wrote an entire section for that video talking about it, but that got way too long and basically it turns into this video. So here we are, and to catch you up super quickly, for the longest time, over 2 years now, my RPG game has had a basic menu where you can just upgrade your stats for a bit of XP, souls, currency, whatever you want to call it. I always knew that this was gonna be a placeholder. But with some new game design ideas and finally a lot of things clicking together, it was time to improve this into something better. Something that didn't just dump points into numbers, but tied the RPG progression into the Metroidvania exploration of my game. And that's where the idea for a skill tree came in, or more accurately, a skill web. The old system was basically just a stat page from a RPG. Functional, but flat. I wanted something that still could handle character progression, but also would be connected with the world itself. Something where exploring the world and progressing your character weren't two separate layers, but intertwined. Areas in the world could be gated until you reached certain nodes in the skill tree, and parts of the skill tree could be locked until you find specific items in the world. And then of course, those two things can loop back in on each other. And the more I thought about that, the more the idea of a traditional skill tree didn't quite capture what I wanted. Instead of one path splitting into 2, 3, and so on, I wanted something more open, more interconnected, where different branches could loop back in and meet each other. So the player could go through this skill tree in a whole bunch of very different routes. That kind of web opens the door to all sorts of interesting possibilities. Major paths being hidden behind hard-to-find keys, alternate routes if you miss those keys, slower but more consistent upgrade paths, branches full of tiny sub-branches with bonuses. Just in general, a layout where two players are unlikely to go through the exact same route. That was the dream, a flexible skill web that gave me enough creative freedom to have players progress through it in a very personalized way. And that's exactly where the problems began. I built a rough version of this skill web inside Unreal's widget blueprint editor, and at first glance, everything worked. Nodes displayed correctly, the web behaved logically, everything seemed fine. But the moment I actually tried editing this tree, moving nodes around, lining things up, Unreal would freeze up. Hard. Just selecting a node could stall the editor for what felt like forever. And of course, being able to freely move these nodes around is pretty essential when you're building something that's supposed to look like a giant interconnected web. At first I thought I might simply have too many widgets for the Unreal editor to handle. But during gameplay, everything ran smoothly. And then when I tested it with well over 100 nodes, as long as they weren't connected, everything turned out fine. And that was the first clue. Every single node in this system has 4 references to other nodes, one for up, down, left, and right. Originally, this was also for directional navigation. Later I decided to switch to a cursor-based selection system, but either way, those references still exist. Because when you unlock any given node, it needs to make available for selection everything that is connected to it. So the real issue wasn't the number of widgets, it wasn't even the fact that they were connected together, it was the fact that my web isn't linear or even directional. We can very easily end up in a situation where we have branch A looping back into branch B, both being connected to, let's say, the center of the skill web. And congratulations, just like that, you've created a loop of reference chains. And apparently the widget editor doesn't really like that. When you click a widget, the editor tries to load everything that widget references. And everything those widgets reference. And everything those widgets reference. And so on. And that's fine, as long as you have a straight line, or even just a traditional one-directional tree structure. But when these references loop back into each other, the editor basically gets stuck in an infinite loop. In-game, this isn't a problem at all, the game handles it all instantly. But the editor, not so much. So I needed a new way to create and move these nodes around, something outside of the widget blueprint editor. Something that wouldn't freeze up every single time a node had to be moved even as much as a pixel. And I considered quite a few different ways to handle this. One idea I had is making a specific level with a lot of actors in it, each one representing a skill node, and then using their world position to spawn in the widget versions on screen. Technically that would have worked no problem, but editing my skill tree inside the actual 3D game world didn't really sound like a great workflow. I know I will need to tweak this thing a lot, and the process needs to be painless and frictionless as much as possible. Not something I dread doing every single time. And that pushed me toward the more overkill solution, building a full custom graph editor for it. Something that I'd never done before, and let me just say, this is not the project you want to do if you're trying to learn this. There's very little documentation on how to do this, not a lot of examples, and even fewer things that could help me with the super weird specific setup that I was trying to make. I do plan on putting a little bit of effort toward making some tutorials on this to kind of alleviate part of this problem, but that's not what we're talking about right now. In short, it was kinda rough. Setting up the graph editor itself actually isn't the hard part. It's tedious and it involves a mountain of classes, sure, but it's pretty straightforward once you know what to do. The real problem I ran into was the nodes themselves. Unreal's graph nodes, the ones you see in Blueprint, are built around the concept of directional pins. Inputs are on the left, outputs are on the right. But I need pins on all 4 sides of my node. And I needed them to connect in both ways in a bidirectional sense. There's no flow direction to my skill tree. Again, this is the whole problem within the widget blueprint editor and why it stalls. Everything needs to be connected both ways on each node. I briefly considered maybe a state machine graph would actually serve me a little bit better here, but the information on that is even more scarce, although in the end it might have actually proved easier to figure that out than the way that I ended up going. Because what I decided to do is dive into Slate to make my own custom Slate node instead. And man, Slate just kind of feels like C++ pretending to be CSS. And that itself isn't actually a problem. You get a lot of nested stuff in your code, but as long as you just organize that neatly, that's fine. The issue is that it still is C++, so every time you make a change, you need to recompile your entire project. Want to change the padding on a bit of text? Recompile. Want to align a widget differently? Recompile. Want to change the corner radius? Recompile. It was painful. But after a lot of struggling and some help from ChatGPT, I eventually managed to hack together a bidirectional pin. It really is just a custom widget that has 2 pins stacked on top of each other, 1 input, 1 output, and contains some logic to reroute connections that are dragged out or into it. When you drag off of it, it connects from the output. When you drag into it, it connects into the input, and then also hooks up the corresponding output back to the input of the other pin. If that sounds confusing, believe me it is. But at this point, it works, and that's all that matters, and I'm never touching that code again. All of this eventually led to something that works. An editor page where I can place these nodes freely, move them around, and connect them however I like. And the positions of these nodes inside of this editor graph are actually then also used to create the actual skill tree in widget blueprints. I can just copy the editor coordinates of every single node into my runtime data. Funnily enough, I was kind of concerned about how that was gonna work when I started this entire project, but that ended up being super trivial. Everything else, yeah, that I'd never want to go through again. But the positional data, very easy. Of course, I will, once I get a little bit more comfortable with making these editor graphs, make a couple proper tutorials on how you can achieve this yourself using some C++. It's gonna take a while before I actually get around to doing that, because I want to do this 1 or 2 more times so that I can actually feel somewhat comfortable with the code itself before I start trying to teach you how to do it. Just not with custom Slate nodes, and absolutely not with bidirectional pins. Ever again. And a very big thank you to all my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help support the channel or get any of the project files in any of my tutorials, there's a link down below to the Patreon page to support me, or alternatively as a YouTube member. My Cave Student tier supporters, Oiku, Earl, Monseville Urno, and my Cave Digger tier supporters, Mauricio Farias.